Namaste, friends. On behalf of atharvforum, I welcome Professor Himanshu Roy, Associate Professor of Deen Dayal Upadhyay College, University of Delhi. We are having this conversation with Professor Roy on his recent book, Political Thought in Indic Civilization, which has been the attention of much focus as it seeks to look at various facets of India's history from an Indian lens rather than a colonial lens. We shall be discussing a part of his work covered in this book based on his voluminous research on the history of Islam in India. Welcome, Professor Roy, to the Atharva Forum. You have mentioned how during the medieval period, when even at the peak of the Mughal Sultanate, uh, Indians did not convert overwhelmingly to Islam. Just 6 to 7% of the Indian population did. What is the reason that, in spite of the fact that wherever Islam went, wherever Islam conquered, it converted entire populations to Islam, but in India, it did not achieve that success?
Very important question, Shashank, and the reason for it is this. When Prophet was alive, he did not permit the invasion of India simply because he treated, forget about we Indians, what we think about ourselves, but the others as well thought that this is a land of perfect freedom. This is one point. Secondly, India has been looked by outsiders as a land of wisdom for centuries. And in 1820s, just to put in the European words, and the Hegel was their philosophical guru. In Germany, in his classroom to his students, Hegel is arguing that India is a land of wisdom. So this and land of wealth, including land of natural wealth. So for centuries, invaders have been coming to India in search of wisdom and in search of wealth, both. And this wisdom and this wealth gave a lot of social mobility to the Indians, different skilled professional labors, which subsequently the British called it caste, emerging from the Portuguese word casta. And we'll discuss about it and the need for decolonizing this narrative of caste and gender and blaming Indian history with a distorted perspective given to us by the colonial historiography. So, a land of perfect freedom, and a land of perfect freedom cannot be colonized mentally, at least by the Islamic invaders. Therefore, despite their gradual expansion of rule, say from 710 AD, starting from Balochistan, etc., and then moving towards South India, and then in Bengal and in other parts of India over the centuries, they remained hardly 6 to 7% of the population, as the sociologists and the historians, professional historians, they have estimated. So the different sections of the population who converted to Islam, out of that, out of the 6-7% of the total population of Muslims, approximately 94-95% of the Muslims were Hindus who converted themselves, and they were from India itself. And a lot, many of them from different professional skills. So it was a land of perfect freedom. Livelihood was wide, available to everyone. Opportunities for livelihood was available to everyone. And therefore, the message with which the Islam came here through the Sufi and through the invaders, etc., both forms, the coercive state apparatus and the ideological state apparatus. Even then, the Indians did not convert to Islam. The sheer reason was that we did not require them. Rather, the world came to India for the wisdom, and therefore, in that way, Islam had a failure in India. If you look from their perspective, because they did not convert the whole of Indians as they could convert, say, 95-98% of the population in Persia now Iran, and for which a lot many of the Parsis fled to India, and they are still there. A lot many of the Jews came to India and other people. This is the reason that we are still Hindus, majority of us.
Okay, so Professor, you use this term, land of perfect freedom. In fact, you mentioned that during the time of Muhammad, invasion to India was disapproved because it was the land of perfect freedom. So that begets the question why and at what point did that transition or that click, if I could call it that, happen, whereby India to the followers of Islam, to the followers of Muhammad, did not remain the land of perfect freedom later on. I mean, what changed from the time of Muhammad, who believed and disapproved of invasion of India, to the point where the invasion started? How did that transformation occur? If you could throw some light on that.
Say purely for the greed reason. During the third caliphate, after the death of Muhammad, even in the first caliphate, it was not approved. They, of course, tried once, 1644, if I remember the date correctly, but it was repulsed. They failed miserably. And again, they tried with a better planning in a more organized way in 710 Common Era, and then they succeeded. And it was a strategic military failure on the part of Indian rulers at that point of time, because in the war, sometimes you lose, sometimes you win. First time we won, they lost, but they attempted again second time, and second time they won. Once they came into India, they gradually expanded their state power. There is no doubt about it. But they came, as I said earlier, that in history, invaders have been coming to India purely for wealth. A lot many of the population came to India to get wisdom, or they settled down in India because it was a highly prosperous land. Can you imagine that in around till 1765, one quarter of the GDP of the world, 23.5%. This is one of the estimates of the economists. 23.5% of the world GDP was alone held by India. So, the status that India commanded in the pre-British time, as it was a sort of superpower in that way, trading superpower. But many times militarily, it lost the battles. And therefore, one of the battles that we lost was in 710. And therefore, the Islamic invaders could come and could seize the powers. And then using those powers, they expanded their rule. But it was purely for the greed to seize its, loot its wealth.
Right, right. So my next question is about the imposition, the barbaric, if I could call it that, imposition of the Arabic Persian culture on the converted Indians, the Muslims in India. And you talk about how Iltamish said that Muslims are like salt between Hindus, who are huge in numbers. Uh, but as power of Muslims grows, he'd either convert Hindus to Muslims or kill them. In the 20th century, as if bringing the same, reading from the same book, Sayyid Ahmad Khan said that Muslims can never accept Hindus as their rulers. So, therefore, my question is, do you see a distinct pattern of connection and a connectivity from the older to the newer leaders of Islam in India who have continued the same traditions of barbarism and of conversion, in your view, in your opinion?
See, there is a connection. There is no doubt about it. In 1896, when the president of the Indian National Congress, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, definitely, you have cited me, and I have cited Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, what he said. There was an Aligarh Muslim or Aligarh movement that was known as Anglo Institute, and then Sir Syed led this group, mostly Ashraf, the elites. See, out of the total population of the Muslims, approximately 5% of the population has been considered as the elite population, the Ashrafs. Out of that 5%, 2.5 to 3% were outsiders. The Arabic, the Persian, the Turks, Uzbeks, etc., they came. And they had a very contemptuous attitudes towards the local Muslims here who converted to Islam, both from the upper crust of the Indic society or the lower order. So the Muslim invaders who came to India, they were contemptuous towards the Indians. This contempt towards as a ruling class, as a ruling elite, this contempt percolated for centuries. And those who spoke the language of the ruling class, who came from Arabia, who came from Uzbekistan, etc., which is now Central Asian republics, that feeling of dominance, that feeling of superiority continued in 19th or 20th century as well. And it's a fact that Sir Syed Ahmad Khan believed that they cannot accept the rule of the democracy, because in the rule of democracy, it will be the Hindus who will be in majority. So this binaries of looking from the religion, the Muslims and the Hindus, the minorities, creation of the minorities, which was constructed by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and the elite of that time. And then the emergence of the majority as a reaction to it. And then the slogans of Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan in 1892, etc., and subsequently its expansion and its gripping among the people. These were all in reaction to the position of demand of democracy that the earlier stage of the Congress had begun from the colonial state. And we find its best reflection in the presidential address of the Indian National Congress president in 1896. If I remember the name, it was Sayani who spoke that this is the feeling that we were the ruling power. And he is addressing as a Muslim, not an Indian. There is a world of difference if you believe in being a Muslim first and Indian second. So once this President Siani reflected in the best way in the presidential address of the Indian National Congress, arguing that we were the ruling powers and now we have been dethroned, and now under the democracy, if they are given the vote, one man, one vote, which is part of the democratic, liberal democratic principles, we will be ruled over by the Hindus. If this is the feeling, if this is the thinking among the elite of the Muslims, and even the poor Muslims are being mobilized to think alike like the Ashrafs. And remember, these are Arjal and Ajlaf, who are roughly 95% of the Muslim populations. So it will be inevitable that the majority, the feeling of the majority will erupt. And we find that there is a linkages and continuation from the Iltutmish period, and then coming to the 19th century and its expansion in the 20th century.
Now, you also observe, Professor Roy, in your chapter, uh, that culture, especially language, was weaponized as a means of conversion. But yet we see, you have also said, that Persian, Arabic, Urdu was contained to city centers, to urban centers, and did not percolate down to the rural areas. Although you also say that 95% of the people were not upper class who were converted. So how do you see this dichotomy? What do you feel are the reasons? What do you think are the reasons why their worst designs, if I could call it that, could not come true of imposing their own language, Persian, Arabic, and Urdu, the way they wanted to, although it did become the state language of administration and all of that?
A very pertinent question, an intelligent question. The majority of the Muslims, they were urbans because they converted as the invaders came and settled down into the forts and the urban towns, and the conversion began. So the conversion began in the urban areas first, and therefore most of the Muslims, or the percentage, larger percentage of the Muslims are in urban areas located. Therefore, the language came along with the invaders as Arabic or Persian, etc. So that had the language, that was the language of the elite, and those who got converted to Islam, that feeling of dominance, that feeling of superiority continued with them, and it became the language of the ruling elite. But fortunately for the Indic civilization, that beyond the urban areas, the more you move into the interiors, uh, this impact of Arabic and Persian did not percolate too deep into the villages. Yes, with the estate, some of the words did percolate. So, in lot many of the regional languages, particularly in Hindi or in Hindustani, in Urdu, we find a lot of the words percolating downwards, which were Arabic words, which were Persian words, and we are familiar with it. Every day in our language, we speak those words. But at least around, say, 60-65% of our languages and the words that we have, those are part of the Indic civilizations. The impact, just I will try to demonstrate through an illustration of the examples in Calcutta, in Bengal, when the survey was done by the British in around 1815, 1820s in Bengal presidency, Calcutta presidency, the Arabic tolls, that madrasas, their numbers was much larger, in fact, double of the Sanskrit tolls. Just imagine a situation that in
Right.
Indic land, the Sanskrit is lesser. The Sanskrit schools are lesser in number than the madrasas, where the Arabic and the Persian is taught. So this was an impact of the language that came along with the invaders in India. But fortunately, the power to resist of the Indians in different forms, powers may not be only of the swords to resist. There are different
Right.
forms of resistance. The way the Indic civilization resisted in different forms, simply because we were the perfect land of freedom. Therefore, still we find roughly 65-70% of the languages in India still survive as Indic language. Of course, 30-35% or even lesser words have percolated downwards.
So very well explained, Professor Roy. Now, my next question is with regards to the fault lines within Islam that you have mentioned, and also this is a common theme that has occurred in other chapters of the book as well. We know of the long-running feud between the Shias and the Sunnis. We also know that there are so many other divisions within Islam, the Khojas and the Memons. You have yourself mentioned about the Arjals and the Ajlafs and
Azlaf.
the Ashraf. You also mentioned how the upper caste Muslims, if are just 5% and 95% are of a lower denomination, are considered a lower denomination. Is this division peculiar to Islam in India, or is that common to Islam in such micro granularity in the entire world? And if it is peculiar to India, how do you view Islam as a cohesive political and social force that seeks to dominate Indian discourse and tends to convert? And we know that the percentage of Muslims has grown from 6 to 7% to probably 15% or probably even more than that.
You have asked me two questions. One is this, that Islam as a cohesive ideological force. Let me tell you, particularly in terms of sectarian division of Shia and Sunni. This conflict between Shia and Sunni or Ahmadiyya, this is global. This is not Indic specific, India special. because we know about Iran, we know about Iraq, etc., Saudi Arabia, but definitely world over, it's the Sunnis who dominate in numerical terms as well, and in lot many of the estates as a part of the estate apparatus, they dominate as a country. They dominate. The Shias are, at least in India as well, the Shias are into the minorities on the margins. Ahmadiyas, of course, are Maimans, of course, are on the margins. It's the Sunni who dominate. This is number one point. Number two, as an ideological cohesion in India and then its expansion. You see, let me tell you one thing, that Quran itself was compiled after the death of Prophet, because it was not recorded at the time of the Prophet. And many of these such in pre-democratic society, these kind of recordings have taken place after the death of that Messiah, after the death of the prophets. Whether in Buddhism, whether in Islam, whether in Christianity, even Kabir, their sayings have been recorded much after death. So we do not know what exactly they said. It's all based on the assumption and the faith. As far as if you apply the logic, it doesn't test the accuracy of what he might have said as a any these Messiah or the Prophet. As far as my knowledge says, that there were different versions of Qurans. The standardized version of Quran came in around 1920, 1924. What we understand as Qurans today, the standardized version came into 1920s. Earlier that there were different versions, because in the what it was believed that this is a saying of Prophet that was recorded much later after his death. Someone say 25 years, few say 75 years, few say 100 years. When Quran itself was not standardized in 17th, 18th century, and their laws, we have the historical records in India that even the laws, what we call it as Shariat, or were different, had different recordings, had different beliefs, etc. So keeping in these traditions of the pre-democratic societies, and its perpetuation and reflections in the contemporary times, still it's not a holistic, consolidated, solid block. But definitely as a psyche of minority, the feeling of minorities that has percolated downwards among a particular people of a religion, which it's their fault if they are not coming out of the Ashraf mindset. See, it was the elite, the Ashraf, who perpetuated, because their number was very less, 2.5 to 3%. Majority being the Arjal and the Ajlaf, and they were Indians. They were not outsiders. They converted in India. So there is a class apart, this division of rich and the poor, the powerless and the powerful. In order to consolidate as one block, an Islamic religious block, you need to, the elite, the political leadership of the Muslims need to feed into the psyche of the poor, that we as a Islamic or religious people need to be one. So if the poor comes into this trap of the elite, it's their fault. Surely, because unless you emancipate yourself, unless you feel that you are local here from this land, see, because the moment you convert yourself and you change your name from Himanshu to Sir Sayyid,
Right.
it means I am getting totally rootless. From Himanshu, if I become Sayyid, I am getting rootless. If my worship, my patterns, my habits, my mustache, everything is imitating the invaders just to be part of the ruling class, in that case, the idea of the ruling class has percolated in my mind, and I begin to behave as also I'm also the ruler. as if I'm also the ruler. This is a dangerous mindset. It means the ruling elite, the Ashraf, and the invaders have succeeded in colonizing my mind, whereas I am 100% Indian. I was born and brought up here. I'm culturally Indian. But instead of being an Indian, my mind after the conversion gets transformed into Makkah and Medina, into Arabic, into Persian.
Right.
So the Holy Land no longer uh, is Indic civilization. The Holy Land gets transformed. So the idea of importance of the motherland of India, India as a motherland, and simply by a virtue of a stroke of a pen or my faith or my conversion, I lose the trust here. This is something is not a good proposition for any country. So this minority mindset is not good for the Indic civilization and for the community, religious community itself. So from a political community, from a social community, I have all the freedom to worship Shiv. I have all the freedom to worship Vaishnav or Kabir or Tulsi. But if I begin to look uh, as uh, Arabic world as holier than India, then the problem starts.
So, Professor Roy, my adjunct question to you with respect to the long answer that you just gave to with regards to the cohesiveness, the social, political, economic cohesiveness, and how do the leadership of Islam uh, try to attempt to keep the whole group together and further the cause of Islam in India. In this context, recently, Mohan Bhagwat, the Sarsanga Chalak of RSS, made a statement, a very popular statement, but very controversial, with regards to a common DNA of the people of India. Because this speaks to the idea of Islam itself and how do they maintain that cohesiveness. So Mohan Bhagwat did say that we have a common DNA and that there is no difference. And this statement was panned by many people, by many Hindu dharmic experts who took exception to this statement. And many said that this statement wasn't understood. How do you view this statement about the common DNA of Hindus and Muslims in India?
You see, definitely Muslims and Hindu. By Muslims, I mean the converts, those who converted their DNA and the others' DNA, those who remain Hindus. It's one. There is no difference between. Tomorrow, for example, or today, I convert myself to Islam. My DNA won't change.
True,
My
true.
psyche will change. Instead of looking towards Kashi, if
Right,
I begin to look towards, say, Makkah,
right, right.
so my DNA remains the same, but my psyche changes. So, what
Right,
Islam did, or the Islamic invaders did, that
right.
they changed the psyche of the converts of India. But
True.
fortunately, these converts were hardly 6 to 7%, and hardly 2.5 to 3% of the invaders came from outside. Imagine a situation that it is a pre-demographic year of 1921. We consider 1921 as a demographic landmark in Indian history, where there is a quantum jump in the growth of the population. Till 1860s, 1870s, once this medical facilities began to develop and the mortality rate began to change. Otherwise, earlier what used to happen, that the death rate, mortality rate, and the birth rate was almost constant, means, and they remained similar. So the population was very less in terms of growth percentage. But once the medical technology, modern medical technology began to expand, the mortality rate became less. And then the population definitely changed. Most of the population among the Muslims because of the minority factor, the psyche. They also had this to multiply. There is no doubt about it. There is a psyche, and minority psyche is definitely different than the majority psyche. In Kashmir, the Muslims are in majority. Their psyche is different than the psyche, say, for example, in other places among the Muslims. So, majority Muslims, or even if you go into Afghanistan or if you go into uh, Iran, since they are in majority there, their psyche is different. So, this minority psyche definitely the psyche and a poverty and the factors that led to multiple percentile growth among the population, which is relatively faster than the non-Muslims. So there is a faster growth of Muslim population. There is no doubt about it. In the last decade, the decline has begun, and even among the Muslim population. But the fact remains that in comparison to the Hindus or other religions, the percentage of growth of the Muslim population is larger. But this psyche of being a minority that needs to be changed, stopped, and the emancipatory zeal must come from within the population. It cannot be imposed. If the Ashraf have succeeded in perpetuating this feeling of religious belonging, and even the poor Arjal and Ajlaf have believed to it, it's their fault. It's sheer their fault, and they must come out of it, must feel that primarily they are not uh, away from Hindus. So the question of the DNA remains the same. They remain Indians. And the importance of being Indian is more than the importance of being a Muslim. That point must be kept in mind.
True, true. Professor Roy, your chapter, while it delineates many divisions of Islam within India, as we just talked about, skips two important names. There must be some good reason why you've done that, which is the Barelvi and the Darul Uloom Deobandi. Now, lately, in the last maybe 30, 40 years, we have seen an ascendancy in these sects within Islam in India. In fact, they have been known to be hardliners, especially the Darul Uloom Deobandi, which has also transcended borders and has percolated into Afghanistan. And it is now a very well known fact, it is not hidden, that the current leadership of the Taliban is inspired by the Deobandi school of Islam, which is extremely dangerous to my mind and to the and would should give sleepless nights to India's geostrategists and security analysts and the entire community. How do you see this ascendancy within India? I mean, where does the tree start to branch out into a really hard-lined and a transmogrified version, if it could get further transmogrified into the Barelvis and the Deobandis and the sort of teachings and preachings that they believe in? How do you see this?
Sasank, this is a mindset of the invaders. Let me tell you, because once the invaders begin to come, seize the state power here, defeated the local rulers here, so the mindset is to expand for the stability of their own rule. This is the mindset of the invaders, and therefore the Iltutmis had said that once we expand and stabilize in Hindustan, we'll give them an option of Islam or death. And I have cited Iltutmis in my chapter. So, Islam or death, if this is the alternative, and it means this is the alternative of an invader. And if a religious school in India in the last, say, 150 years, which has been set up in India or which has emerged from India, if they are moving towards Afghanistan and to the other parts of the world, it means that feeling of creating a pure Islam, a pure religion. And this trend has been going on from time to time, particularly after the death of Aurangzeb from 1715 onwards. It's argued by the historians that Wahhabism, uh, becoming more pure, more religious minded, instead of being more secular. If you have the mindset of moving towards more Islamic purity, this is the mindset of being an invader, and this is not a good trend in a modern democratic and secular society like India, that needs to be checked urgently.
Right, right. As Islam progresses, we know that also from the history of Islam, within a certain territory, it becomes more and more hardliner in its context, in the way it sees the world. So when they are 6 to 7%, they are more secular, and as they advance, their idea of Darul Harb and the way they see the world sort of starts to change, and they become more and more hardlined in terms of how they see the world around them. That's what you are primarily asserting, I think.
Yes.
All
Yes.
right.
Yes.
Sure. So therefore, my next question is got to do with the bifurcation of Islam by journalists into moderate and hardline Islam. I mean, you get to hear this from many journalists in India who have tried to explain terrorism and terrorists as sons of schoolmasters. In that context, do you lend credence to this idea that there is, in essence, Islam that is moderate and Islam that is hardline? Are there two distinctions within the text of Islam, essentially, within these two divisions that journalists would like to present to us?
It's always has been, Shashank, but let me tell you the fact. Uh, uh, if you read Quran, and it has been written in an Arabic script, and there are different versions, translations apart. Uh, the alternative that was given, as I said, answering your previous question, and Iltutmish, in a very blunt way, when representatives went there, uh, representatives went to meet him, why not to expand the Islam here? The answer that he gave to them was Islam or death. It means, it one doesn't convert to Muslim, becomes Muslim, or converts to Islam, he has to pay the tax. So this very mindset, in contradiction to the other religion, which is called as Hinduism or pagan or infidels or kafirs, there is a celebration of diversities. Each family in India, uh, we call it Hindu. Hindu is, it was already a generic term. Subsequently, there developed a commonality of religion and cultural nationalism, etc. So, if you look at each family, they have their own Kul Devi or Kul Devta. Each family, each village has their own Kul Devi and Kul Devta. And we have been celebrating these differences. We do not finish or force others to get converted to my Kul Devi or Kul Devta. We do not
Okay.
force everyone in our village or where we stay in Gali or Mohalla to follow my religion or my Kul Devi. But if some other religion forces me to get converted to the religion of the Prophet or the Christ or someone else, in that case, the problem begins. The problem of being anti democrat. This is thoroughly against the principles of democracy.
Right.
In India, we have not been forcing by sword to convert to my Kul Devi, which each family in India has a different Kul Devi or a Kul. So, gender wise, we do not make a difference. Reason wise or sect wise or belief wise, we do not force someone and try to convert, because this has been inbuilt in our Sanatani civilization, the Hindu civilization. The word India, we all know it. It has been discussed for decades and centuries. That, and we were part of a civilization who developed and evolved and uh, across the river Sindh, and then from there we expanded this culture to different parts of the world, including Southeast Asia. If you remember Bali and Sumatra, and let me tell you, if you read the Sanskriti ke Char Adhyay, which I have quoted in the book, cited in the book, Ramdhari Singh Dinkar, the nationalist poet, has given an example that before it became Islamic, Saudi Arabia, the word But Parasti is a upbranch derivative of the word Buddh. It was a temple or a monastery. As a trading nations, we have been going all along the world, all in different parts of the world, including in Central Asia. So as the excavations are being done, as now the satellite imageries are being used, the modern technology, we find new temples and monasteries coming up in Central Asia and in other parts of the world, including Afghanistan and other parts of the world.
Right.
So if you do not celebrate, if you do not tolerate, we do not tolerate, we celebrate. The others tolerate. So this feeling of tolerance is not a democracy.
True. True. We
It's the
accept.
celebration of the diversity is democracy. So the
Right.
moment you do not celebrate, you simply tolerate. And for tolerating, if you are charging a tax, that is
True.
something very undemocratic, if not
And,
horrible.
and it is anathema to Bharatiya Sanatani
Yes,
culture. Yeah. Yeah.
yes.
So, Professor Roy, my next question has to do with another aspect of Islam, and how it spread within Bharatvarsh, and that is Sufism. Now, Sufism has been romanticized in Indian culture through Bollywood, and in fact, even Indian Prime Minister, the current incumbent Prime Minister, Sri Narendra Modi ji, has talked about how Sufism is probably an option and the softer underbelly of Islam. However, we know that Sufis like Muinuddin Chishti inspired invaders to invade India in a most barbaric form and to convert and kill Kafirs in India. In this context, how do you view Sufism and its contribution to Islam? Do you view it? Is it your opinion that it is, in fact, what it is painted out as being in popular culture? Or do you think that this is another aspect of the same culture of Islam, conversion, and non acceptance of the Kafir, and so on and so forth?
As I have discussed in my book, and it's among widely discussed among the historians in particular, Sufism emerged from Persia, and it emerged from the bottom among the from the popular culture from the bottom, and it traveled to India in around 11th century, 10th, 11th century onwards, gradually, and expanded to different parts of the country. Historians have argued two aspects, and let me put it into an academic forum and a platform, that Sufis have adopted two ways. One, as you rightly said, it has softened the brutality of Islam in the way, the language that is used. But let me tell you, within Islam, there is no concept of pure Islam, there is no concept of mazar, but there emerged a concept of mazar and etc. etc. I have cited in my chapter as well that how in Bengal and in other Western India and Eastern India, this Sufi many times using force perpetuated the idea of conversion to expand Islam. So it has double face, the softer face where it perpetuates the conversion through hegemony, through
Right.
consensus, by voluntarily appealing to the downtrodden, or the poor in fact understands the language of Islam, and though it gets infatuated by it, likes the words, the language, the worship, and then he or she gets converted into that particular religion. But where the force is to be applied openly or subtly, as in case of Kashmir, I have given the examples of Kashmir, and I have given the examples of Western India and Eastern India, Bengal in particular, where we have seen that in the historical illustration and examples, double face of Sufism is visible glaringly. So definitely not as the invaders used in terms of the state power, the coercive state apparatus, not purely coercive state apparatus, ideological definitely, more soft, appealing, and therefore creating a softer version of Islam, the legitimacy as well as a dominant ideology, a religion. So definitely this double face of Sufism has been visible in India, and that as a part in the part of the history that the examples that I give you, that reflects is double version.
Right, right, right. So, Professor Roy, in your chapter, you have observed that in the 1870s, you say the facade of composite culture, Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, as it is called, in the absence of political power, had blown off. You, to my surprise, you mention how Muslim families to this day maintain their gotra, and they still pray to their own to their Hindu deities, which to me comes as some sort of a surprise. I'm sure the viewers too would find this interesting. How do you reckon? Because Sunnis dominate Islam even in India, but you still have this peculiarity, which I'm sure does not exist anywhere in the world, as far as Islam is concerned.
Yeah.
Hindu
Shashank,
culture.
from Gujarat to different parts of India, if you observe, if you do the sociological studies and different sociologists, see my book that and the chapter that you are citing is in a study of interdisciplinary works that have taken place as sociologists, and then historians, then literatures. So I have tried to put from these accumulated wisdoms of the different disciplinary studies that have taken place on the Indic society. And if you look at when the first generation is converted, many of the traits of Hindu that perpetuates in the second generation or third generation, surname, for example, Shah, Patels, the Muslims and the Hindus, you will find the similar surname.
Right.
Munaf Patel, for example, he is keeping the surname Patel.
Yes, or even a hardliner like Zakir Nayak keeps his Nayak
Yes.
surname.
And I will expose this colonial narrative, because these Nayaks, these Shah, these Patels, they were not castes, they were a skilled labor, these were professions. For example, Upadhyay, this is an assistant professor.
Right.
Mahamahopadhyay, Mukhopadhyay, Gangopadhyay, Acharya.
Yes.
Then your Patnayak, your Kanungos, your Rais, these are all skilled post designations, and these are thorough secular. But now it has been identified with your caste, etc., and these all colonial narratives that began after, say, 1784 onwards, under a plan of deliberate designed to malign and distort the Indian history. But the first generation Muslims perpetuated, carried forward their Gotra, their Kul Devi, Kul Devta, Gram Devta, and all kinds of. They did not know how to do this namaz. They were totally unaware of. So once the purity of Islam movement, and that has been going on from time to time. In 1920s, again, there was a movement for purity of Islam, and different historians have referred to it. Again, there is a movement, the schools that you referred to, Barelvi and etc., they keep on moving towards purity of Islam. They think Islam as democratic social traditions, which we may not agree with. And there is a whole lot of discussion and debates that's going on, whether the moderate or the extremist version, that the journalists and the public discourse that happens. So this first generation, at least, or the second generation, that carry forward their own cultural legacy of pre-conversion years or of their lives. Unless otherwise, it is purified, which is absolutely not conducive to a democratic society or to an Indic civilization that we have. You are purifying what? Purifying of what? The very roots of the Indic civilization. You are trying to make him more Arabic and Persian. What you are purifying to do? Right. You are cutting his roots, or you are cutting off from your own roots. So if you are cutting off from your own roots, from the entire history and culture of the Indic civilization, your own past of Hindu civilization, then in that case, there will be reactions. There will emerge a other kind of feeling against you. This is nothing to do with the hostility against Islam or religion, but because of your stupidity that you are doing. Right. So this kind of purification of religion leads to, or has led to, among different families, among the newly converts, which we find is totally cut off of, or makes him the rootless of the Indic civilization. So what I refer to it is that that composite culture was this, that after the conversion in the first generation or in the second generation, you find this Gotra carrying on, surname carrying on, and many other things, including, if you, Shashank, I in my childhood have seen in some of the regions that Muslims women putting on vermilion on their head. Now it's no longer visible. No longer visible. This cap, a skull cap, this was not there in 60s and 70s. People used to put on their local cultural caps of the locality where they used to live. This universalization of the skull cap is a very gradual process that emerged out of, say, 1990s in particular. It was not there. Still, if you go into the more such regions which has not much developed in terms of infrastructure, not much connected with internet and these cultural tools, social, or the old generation, they still do not use skull caps. Right. So this kind of fusion with the local community from where they converted into Islam, that the old Hindu civilization and their cultural traits still continued for generations. That I'm talking about as a part of the composite culture.
True. So, Professor Roy, what I can fathom is that the assiduous rootedness of the converted Hindus into Islam, who still maintain these cultural motives and still practice, in a way, their ancient Hindu culture by keeping the Gotra and maintaining their deities. And you have very well expostulated the idea that has been probably propelled by the Muslim leadership of purification of Islam, because they can see that these ideas that the converted Hindus are rooted in can threaten Islam itself and its spread within India. And therefore, the idea, I believe, of the Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, how do you see these terms? Because Ganga and Jamuna both find mention within the ancient Sanatani culture. We know that Yamuna and Ganga are venerated, deeply venerable, and they find mention in the Bhagavad Puran and the entire, they are spread across, the mention is spread across the entire Shastra. How do you see this appropriation as a weapon? Do you see the Muslim leadership appropriating parts of the Hindu culture and presenting it as its own? Because that's a strategy that you might know is followed by Christian evangelicals in India to devastating effect within the tribal areas of India. So, your
You say
comments.
this Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, which has been used mostly in 20th century, particularly from say 1920s and 30s, or most emphatically after 47, once the partition was done. This kind of tehzeeb is not very the focus or emphatic focus on tehzeeb was after this partition in independent India. Before that, if you look at the entire discourse, political discourse was not focused on the tehzeeb. If had it been focused on the tehzeeb, in that case, they would not have demanded for partition. Why, after all, they demanded partition? Had they focused on tehzeeb and the composite culture, it means they did not accept this composite culture and tehzeeb. So my argument of this, or the counter argument rather, on this emphatic focus on tehzeeb has emerged sheer in a post 47. It's a post 47 development, just to alleviate, just to soften this feeling of hurt that we have in our mindset because of the partition. So because this Gotra was there, that DT was there, and all kinds of culture was there. That was composite. Then the Muslim leadership and the religious leadership, political leadership and the religious leadership, they combined to wipe out this composite culture by purifying Islam, purifying out of, rooting out the Indic civilizational culture among the converts. So if you are trying to purify, if you are trying to root out the Indic civilization, what is this composition then left off? What is left off in this composite culture and tehzeeb? And then simultaneously, you are also demanding and voting for Muslim League in 1947.
Yes.
And then once the partition is done, still you are, if you look at the debates of the Constituent Assembly, these Muslim representatives are asking still for separate electorate, minority rights. And therefore you find the reactions of Patel, that you decide your loyalty. He is speaking in two public places, one in Lucknow, another in Calcutta in 47-48. So this tehzeeb emphasis, this develops after 47 onwards, once the partition has been done. It was not a tehzeeb. The tehzeeb was what I shared with you regarding the part of the Hindu culture, which the Muslim leadership tried to root it out, wipe it out by making the Islam more pure, the families more Islamic.
True. So, Professor Roy, this is also a good opportunity for me to kind of probably add and ask another follow-up question with respect to what's happening. In fact, as we are talking, we have a raging controversy in parts of Karnataka where girls are insisting, student girls are insisting that they would like to wear and have the right of wearing a burqa, the hijab, to the colleges. And I think that is again coming from the same purification of Islam context. Probably I could link it to that. I don't know how you would want to see that as. I think that is the same purification of Islam strategy that they are following in your mind.
Say I won't go into that, Shashank, but I'll share with you my personal experiences into the classrooms of Kerala. In the Kerala University, I'm invited to conduct some few classes there. So in the MA classes, I found that some of the girls were sitting with that hijab in the classrooms. My colleagues told me, and remember, Kerala is ruled by the CPM.
To the communist.
My colleagues told me that 15-20 years ago, this hijab was not visible in Kerala. This hijab and the Islamic culture is coming because of the Gulf money. So the more you are moving towards prosperity, more you are trying to imitate a culture which is Arabic.
Right.
It is not Indian. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, you behaved like any other Indic civilizational part, or you behaved like a student of India. But after the Gulf arrival of the Gulf money, you are trying to purify yourself, making yourself rootless out of the Indic culture by using all this kind of hijab. And let me tell you, very recently I read that it was Sikandar Lodi in the 13th, 14th century. Uh, uh, and under this translation mission, the books are, some of the Persian writings are being translated. That first time we find that a burqa or a face cover is being introduced into the India for the women of haram. So this face covering of the woman in particular began with the haram. And then subsequently it percolated downwards and among the different, see, if you, in the peasant population, in the labor population who works into the fields and into the workshops, you cannot use burqa and work into the fields. It's here not possible. So it was mostly a fashion or a requirement, not requirement, it's a fashion, maybe imposed for a woman who have a prosperous, comfortable life, who do not work, because once you work into the fields, you cannot use burqa or this kind of veils. So we find, my observation is this, my colleagues' observation is this, that this kind of face covering is leading towards a greater Islamization, which is very not good for the Indic civilization. In the name of individual freedom and choice, we cannot let it get perpetuating among the larger population in a secular society.
Right.
It has been argued among the academicians that we find in different books and in public discourse that it's my choice. If it is voluntarily, if I am covering my face, what the problem is. You remember, most of the democratic Europe is not permitting these in public places. You simply cannot use, yes, you simply cannot cover your face in France and in most of the Western European countries. Only Britain has permitted hijab.
True.
So these are the some of the problems. Yeah.
So, Professor Roy, thanks a lot for your expositions, and your vast experience has stood us in good stead in understanding the colonial mindset behind interpreting Indian history to their own advantage. So, as I was saying earlier, that history is written by conquerors. So, your book that you have edited and the chapter that you have written, your work would go a long way in dispelling the colonized version of history, and would correct the perceptions that many harbor in their minds with respect to the spread of Islam within India, as well as with respect to the modern day, the contemporary manifestation of it, and how it is being perpetuated within the political milieu of India, if I could put it that way. So once again, thanks a lot on behalf of
Thank you.
Atharva Forum.
Thank you, Shashank. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.